Cameron. So if you knew my Cameron was and still is supremely confident. So the issue was only, Dad, just let go so I can ride. And, I knew he couldn't ride. I'm holding on to the back of the bike. We have the training wheels off, but I'm holding on to the back of the bike, and I know I'm doing most of the balancing. He doesn't know that. He is certain he's doing it. And so he keeps kind of like, Dad, let go, like you're holding me back. I just want to ride. And so we're working on it, and you as you're following along, you can kind of get the feel when they're starting to balance. And so I felt like, okay, I think he might be figuring this out. I think he's got it. And so I'm holding onto the back of the bike as he's going, and I let it go, and he's riding. And with the first ride where it's a little like the wobbly, is that kind of ride, but he's doing it. And he did it for like 5 or 6 seconds. And then there was the ball in the sidewalk. See, and he's riding down the sidewalk, and then there's a ball, and like as a first-time rider, this is a pretty big crisis to encounter a ball and have to navigate around it. And so he's only riding 5, 6 seconds, and he sees the ball, and of course he jerks the bike, and the bike goes one way, and he goes the other, and he's sprawled out on the grass, and he wipes out. Not a big deal. He was sure that would never happen again. In fact, if you knew Cameron, he had already determined in his 4-year-old mind that next time I'm going to just jump the ball. Like that's just how Cameron was. He's certain that would be the right course of action the next time around. But here's the part I want you to catch. Like, here he was, like riding the bike for the very first time. He did it. And then he didn't. Like, he had the thrill of first time ever, and then the disappointment of, and it's over. 6 seconds in, the ball wrecked me. And I want you to kind of hold that idea as we step into our passage today. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 14. As we already read, we read a parallel passage in John chapter 6, but we're going to be in Matthew 14, and it's the passage where Jesus walks on the water. Amazing. So Matthew is the one that records that then Peter walked on the water until he didn't. Right? Like the bike. He was doing it, and then he wasn't. And so not too many steps in, Peter sinks, and then Jesus asks this really, well, it's going to seem obvious at first, but I think we'll find it's interesting. The question is, why did you doubt? And we're going to explore that question today. Like, that Jesus asked him this after he had walked on water for a bit and then went under, not doing it anymore. And then when Jesus reaches out and grabs him, he just asks the question, so why'd you doubt? And so we're going to explore that today. So what I want to do is, we've done every week, I want to kind of set the scene. I want us to see what leads up to the situation, because putting this all in context helps us understand the significance of the question and what Jesus is getting at. And so in the beginning of Matthew chapter 14, Jesus gets the news that John the Baptist is dead. And if you recall those events, he was beheaded on a whim. So he was killed on a whim at a birthday party for, where is it? Well, anyway. So beheaded by Herod the Tetrarch is who it was. And so he had a birthday party, and somebody did a dance that impressed him, and he said, you know what, that was amazing. Anything you want, and I'll give it to you. And somebody's like, ask for John the Baptist's head. And so that's what happened. That's how he was killed. So verse 13, we read this. This is in Matthew chapter 14. When Jesus heard what had happened, this is referring to John the Baptist's death, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. So Jesus took off to get some much needed space alone from the crowds, but they saw where he was going, followed him on land. So when he steps out of the boat in his alone space, it's not alone space, it's crowd space. And they're waiting for him. And so here's Jesus. He's grieving the death of John the Baptist, and he's looking for this time alone, but he has compassion on the people. And so he begins to minister among them. And so that day passed, and if any of this is sounding familiar, we were here a couple of weeks ago. The day passed, it's now evening, it's dinner time, and so he asked the disciples, or the disciples asked him, like, hey, it's kind of getting late. Probably we should send them home. And he's like, well, why don't we feed them? And so the disciples size up the situation and say, I don't think that's a great idea. There's no way. We don't have the resources, all of that. And so a couple of weeks ago, we looked at this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 plus, probably more like 10,000 or more, with a couple of fish and 2 loaves. And so they kind of got to play in the middle of that miracle. Like every basket they carried was part of the miracle, and then the basket of leftovers they had at the end was part of the miracle. And so all of this has just happened. And so I want you to see the backdrop then before this event of Jesus walking on water, that it's been a long day, a couple days of dealing with crowds and people, and there's grief running in the background. And for the disciples, they're fresh off the heels of a pretty wild miracle that they were in the middle of. And so after all of that, everybody is in need of some much needed rest. Jesus is, the disciples are, and probably more than ever at this point, because they didn't get the rest they needed just a little bit ago. And so you pick up in verse 22, and here's what we read, that immediately after this, the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. And so now let's read what happens. We're going to read it, and this time we're going to get to see what happens with Peter. So we read it in the parallel passage. So after sending them home, this is verse 23, Jesus went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from land, for a strong wind had risen and they were fighting heavy waves. So about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. And when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified in their fear, and they cried out, "It's a ghost!" And Jesus said to them at once, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here." And then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out, grabbed him, and said, "You have so little faith. Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back in the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. So Jesus finally got the alone space that he was looking for, right? That solitary place up in the hills where he could get alone with God, where he could rest, where he could grieve, where he could pray. And meanwhile, the disciples, while Jesus has his alone space in the hill, his prayer space, the disciples are miles from shore, stuck in a storm. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to back up just a minute, and I want to ask a question. How exactly did these disciples find themselves in a storm? Ready for the answer? Jesus sent them there. In fact, if you recall, the words were, he insisted that they get in the boat and go. So they did what Jesus told them to do, and now look, they're in the middle of a storm. Like, Jesus sent them there. Why would he do that? And the answer to that question is always that Jesus wants them and us to see some things that we will only see from the storm. To understand some things, to feel some things, to experience some things that we can only experience in the storm. And so the storm would serve as a backdrop to increase their faith and their confidence in who Jesus is, and we'll see that at the end. But we can put it this way. There are some lessons in life that can only be learned in the storm. Like, isn't this true? That there's some lessons that we just learn the hard way, but man, once we've learned them, they stick. Like, this is true about us, but the things we learn about ourselves, true about the things we learn about life through some of the storms, true about our faith and how we engage with God and God's presence with us. Like, all of these things get revealed and stretched in the storms. See, what happens when we experience these things is we go beyond facts and we touch the spiritual place of faith. So it's one thing to say, God is with you when it's hard. That's a fact. And it's quite another thing to experience, oh, I can tell you, God is with you when it's hard. I've experienced it. See, this is the power of us telling the stories, what we call testimonies, of God's faithfulness. Because when I get to experience God's faithfulness and I share that with you, you who are hoping to experience God's faithfulness, all of a sudden your heart picks up and say, maybe God will be faithful with me too. That's why we tell our stories. Because they're stories where we get to remind each other that God is with us, that He's faithful in the middle of the stuff. Jesus sent them into the middle of the storm. And while none of us would ever pick the storm, right? Like if Jesus said, hey, I'm going to send you out in the lake, storm or no storm? You're like, yeah, no storm, please. You know? Like that's what we would choose every time. But think about this. If you were to look back on your life, if you were to tell some of your life story and say, just give us 3 of the big growth points in your life. Just tell us 3 of them where you feel like I grew as a person, I grew in my faith. You are not going to be pointing to mountaintop experiences. You're going to be pointing to some hard things where God showed up, where you had to stretch. There are some things that we only learn in those storms. So Jesus had a reason to send them out into the lake where they were about to experience something that was very unique. So after the crowd is gone, Jesus is finally alone. And remember, this is what they've been trying to do for a couple days now before the crowds met them on the shore. And so he's on the hill by himself praying. They're out in the water. And, you know, Jesus is alone. And in a way, they're alone too. They're the sole boat out there in the storm, trying to figure out how to navigate it. So they're together, but they're like alone in the storm. And so here they are, they're out in the middle of the lake, they're trying to get to shore, and we're told that they were in trouble. Which, you know what that means. It means like we've tried our best and we don't have an answer. Like we've done everything we know to do. We have rowed as hard as we can. We have worked as hard as we can. And nothing. Same situation. Like they come in, like I want you just to imagine, like if you've been at this, they come in and they came into this thing exhausted. And so now they've been working against this storm. And it's dark and they're tired and they've been battling the wind and the waves They're in trouble, like all our effort, all our experience. Like these guys have experience on the water, but it's not enough right now. All of their rowing, nothing is going to matter or make a difference. And again, I want you to remember, so they started out in the boat before dark. And here's how we know, because we're told that they get off in the boat, Jesus goes off to pray, and while he's praying, it gets dark. So from daylight, whatever time of year this is, let's just say the sun is setting at 8. So they've been out in that boat, and they have been working to try to find their way to shore. And we're told that it's the 4th watch of the night, finally, when Jesus comes walking on the water. So 4th watch would be somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So if they started this journey at 8, like that's a long time to be battling the storm, right? Like you're working and working, and now it's 9, and then 10, and then 11 p.m., and then it's midnight, and you haven't made progress. And then it's 1 a.m., and then it's 2 a.m., and then it's 3 a.m. Like you have been working your tails off for what? Still in the same place. After hours of exhausting work, muscles aching, drenched, cold down to your bones, right? The wind is still howling. The waves are still crashing. And they still have no answer. Like weary to the point where they're wondering, like, are we going to make it to the shore? They're in trouble. And I think we can begin to imagine how weary they would be. Can you? Like, can you imagine being in that boat and you just want to be warm and dry? You just want to see the shore? You just want the storm to be done? Like, can you imagine what a long night of futility that has been? Or let me ask it another way. Have you ever felt like that? In some season of your life, whatever storm you went through, where you feel like, I have rowed, and I have rowed, and I have rowed, and I am still right in the middle of the storm. I have worked my tail off, and I'm still right in the middle of the storm. I've brought everything I know to bring to it, and I'm still right in the middle of the storm. Like some of us, we can relate to feeling helpless, to feeling overwhelmed, to feeling like my best efforts are not and will not be enough. That no matter what you do, the circumstances remain the same, the anxiety remains the same, the stress remains the same, and you don't have an answer to stop the madness. The storm just keeps coming. And so you're tired and you're weary, and as far as you can see from where you are, there's no end in sight. I don't see us getting to the shore. That's what the disciples are feeling. You've been there. They're stuck in the middle of the storm, and it feels like a losing battle. They're longing for daylight, longing for the shore, longing for the night and the storm to be over. And so now the situation is desperate. They're in trouble. They have no answer. And so watch what happens. And then Jesus went out to them walking on the lake, walking on the water. And so this is where we say, oh, this is where Jesus walked on water. Don't jump there yet. Look what it says first. Jesus went out to them. And yes, he did it walking on water, but don't miss this. Jesus walked on the water, but he did it so he could go out to them. So they're stuck in the middle of a lake, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm. Who can help them? They're not just far from land, they're far from help. And then we read that Jesus came to them. So I don't know what you've ever pictured, but somehow in my mind or on the flannel graphs, when Jesus is walking across the water, it doesn't seem as stormy. Like it's kind of like a little bit of waves, but he's walking like it's a storm. And so here they are in the middle of this storm. And I don't want us to miss the significance of this. That Jesus shows up in the middle of their storm. Like if you feel stuck in some situation, isn't that what you want? If I can't get out of the storm, then I just want to know that you're going to show up in the storm. And it's this reminder that no matter what you face, no matter how limited your options, no matter where you are, like Jesus can come to you in the storm. I don't know what's going on in all your lives, but I know enough in dealing with groups of people that there's somebody who's like, that's for me today. That I feel like I'm alone, I feel like I've been rowing, and I feel like it hasn't made a difference, and I just want to know that Jesus is going to show up. But here's the interesting thing, right? Like Jesus shows up at 3 o'clock in the morning. He comes toward them walking on the water. The disciples saw him and they'd be like, it's Jesus. In fact, it never crossed anybody's mind like, oh, Jesus came to us. They were afraid and they're like, okay, I don't know what it is, but it has to be a ghost. Like what else could it be? Like the sight of him coming at them was unsettling. And so imagine, like they've been freaked out all night against this raging storm, and so they've been working and working, and it hasn't made any difference whatsoever. And so here they are. They're finally see something, and like, can you imagine being in a place where you're like, could this get any worse? And then somebody says, hold up, what's that? And there's this shadowy figure coming across the water. Like, what is that? And whatever it is, it's coming straight toward your boat. Is that a good thing? Maybe, but maybe not. And so they freak out. Their best guess is that it's a ghost because that's the only thing they can figure out that would come across the water. And they're not expecting Jesus to show up. Nobody's saying, I bet that's Jesus, because they assumed they were out of reach. They were not expecting Jesus to show up in the storm. They were actually surprised. So it's funny, had they known that he was going to come, then they would have been relieved to see him, but they didn't know he was coming. And so their immediate response is fear, and Jesus immediately settles them and says, it's all right, I'm here, don't be afraid. So what are they afraid of? Well, a storm, not getting back to shore. Let's throw ghosts in there now. And so Jesus assures them, you don't have to be afraid of ghosts or storms or getting safely back to shore. So, like, this has been a pretty eventful deal so far, right? And we haven't gotten to Peter walking on the water. So Jesus is walking to them. He says, you don't have to be afraid, it's me. And so Peter calls out, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Am I the only one who's like, I cannot believe you just asked that? In fact, I feel confident there are 11 guys in the boat saying, I can't believe you just asked that. Like, it's the strangest request. And here's what I want you to notice. Is he sure this is Jesus? He's not. So here's what he says. If this is you, Jesus, just for verification, ask me to come out walking on the water. I can think of some other ways to verify. Like, what's my name? What did we have for breakfast this morning? When's my birthday? Like, there's a whole bunch of things you could ask for verification that is not me stepping out onto the water in the middle of a storm. Like, I don't know where you are. Maybe I don't have as much faith as you. But I likely would never have asked this question. And it would have never even come to my brain. Like to say, well, Jesus, if that's you, I might as well walk on water too. And it's not just the storm. Like if it was a perfectly peaceful night, still probably wouldn't have popped into my brain that I would walk on water with Jesus. And here's the other thing. Like it's not just that it wouldn't pop in your brain, but in the middle of the storm, where's the safest place to be right now? In the boat. Now, it's not a great place to be. It hasn't been wonderful, but still, it's the safest place available to you right now. And so there are all kinds of reasons for you to not think it's a great idea to step out of that boat, right? You got the wind, the waves, the relative safety of the boat, and there's that little detail that you can't walk on water. And so like there's some reasons why this would never cross our minds to get out of the boat. And Peter has this, and here's how I refer to it, like this amazing burst of faith. Like it's almost this outburst of faith, this outrageous faith that wells up in him. And here's Peter's crazy faith. I want you to see it. Peter says, if that's you, Jesus, here's what I know. That if you say the word, I could walk on water too. Put that in any scenario, and that's incredible faith, right? He believes that if Jesus says the word, he can walk on water. There's no other reason to ask. And I want you to notice, he doesn't just step out like, I'm coming, Jesus. He waits for the word. He knows better than that. So he's like, you say the word, I'll step out of the boat and I'll walk on water too, if you say the word. And so Jesus says, all right, Peter, come on. Let's walk on water. And so he gives the word, and Peter doesn't hesitate. Throws his leg over the boat and steps out. So here's how I know faith works, at least for me. I'll speak for me. You ever have a moment where you second guess? Like where Jesus would say, okay, Peter, come. And you'd be like, that was the dumbest thing I ever requested. What was I thinking? Like, I can't walk on water. Why would I even blurt that out? But his burst of faith is more than that. It wasn't just something he blurted out. He believed it. And so Jesus says, come on, let's do it. And he doesn't hesitate. He steps out of the boat, and so this is again where I would love to see this. Like, are his feet getting wet? Are they inches under the water? Is he literally on top of the water? Is he walking on it like it's concrete? Is he splashing it all? Like, I want to know. It doesn't really matter, but I just want to know, like, what was this like when you throw your leg over the boat and step onto the water? None of us have ever experienced that. So Jesus gives the word. Peter steps out of the boat onto the water for a few steps. Go back to the bike, right? He was doing it. He was riding it for the very first time, and then there was a ball, and he wasn't. And here's Peter. He's doing it for the very first time. He's walking on water. Oh, and then he wasn't. You ever thought about the other disciples sitting in the boat, jaw dropped, watching Peter walk on water? What that did to their faith? So I'll say this, again, I'll speak for me. Once I saw Peter doing it, I'd be like, okay, I'm in. Like, now that I'm seeing it as a possibility, till he sank. And I'm like, yeah, I'm good, right here. I'll stay in the boat. So Peter's doing just fine on the water until he's not. And we're told that he looks around at the wind and the waves. And all of a sudden he's like, wait a second, I don't think this is a great idea. Like, what was I thinking? It's a raging storm out here, and I'm walking on water. Maybe he's even trying to figure out, can I walk back to the boat? Can I make it that far? So he became frightened. He began to doubt, and he starts to go under, and he calls out to Jesus, and Jesus reaches down and grabs him, and then he comments on his faith. Peter, you have so little faith. So can we all agree? Peter had some pretty significant faith here. Like, he walked on water, believing that if Jesus said the word, that he would do it. So it's kind of interesting for him to say, oh, Peter, you have so little faith. Like, I don't know. I think that was pretty impressive right there. One English translation, our English translation, so of this phrase is we translate into multiple words. So it's a phrase. Peter, you have so little faith. But the original language, the Greek, says it almost like a one simplified word. Little faith. Almost like a nickname. Not quite, but it's like this little word. And so it's more like Jesus says, little faith. What happened? Why'd you doubt? You ever feel like that one could maybe fit you? Not in a condescending way, but, oh, little faith. What just happened? Why'd you doubt? And so this is the question. Peter, little faith. Why did you doubt? And again, when we hear that question, it seems fairly obvious, right? The answer to it. Because I looked and I noticed, like, this is dangerous. And I remembered I can't walk on water. And so all of a sudden I was like, bad idea what we're doing here. I don't walk on water and there's a raging storm. So yeah, this is not great. So I got scared. Which wouldn't be inaccurate, right? But Jesus' question is so interesting. What happened, Peter? Why did you doubt? So back up and walk through it. Peter was filled with faith when he thought it was Jesus. In an instant, when he thought that was Jesus, he forgot about the storm. He forgot about all that long, exhausting night. He forgot about the wind and the waves. He forgot about how tired he was. And here's what he knew the moment he thought that was Jesus, that he was capable of walking on water if Jesus would say the word. And so when Jesus told him, he stepped out of the boat, knowing full well that on his own he would never be able to walk on water. So this took some faith, right? Like real world practical faith. I don't know if you're aware of this, but sometimes in church we like to talk about theoretical faith. What I might have done had I believed. You know, so for Peter, if he didn't get out of the boat when Jesus said it, he'd be like, wait, no, that was a bad idea. Peter could tell you about the time. So there was this time I asked Jesus if I could walk on water, and Jesus said, yeah, do it. And then I was like, man, I'm so tired. I don't really feel like walking right now. And you know, it's kind of like stormy and I've been working all night and, you know, but I don't doubt a minute. I knew I could have when he said the word. It wasn't a great time for me to walk on water. Like, it'd be theoretical faith, which, like, it sounds corny to throw it out there, but this is how many of us do faith. We talk about would have, could have, should have, instead of stepping out of the boat. Peter had more than a theoretical faith. He had this belief that he could walk on water if Jesus told him to. And he had the proof. He did it. Not just stepped out of the boat, but walked on water. All of the disciples got to witness this. So now, keep all of that in mind when Jesus asks this question. Here's what he's asking. Peter, you took some steps. You walked on water because you believed in me. You were literally in the middle of doing it, in the middle of the miracle, in the middle of doing the impossible, and then you doubted. What happened? Why'd you doubt? I mean, so think about it. The fact that you're walking on water has the potential to reinforce your faith, right? Like, this is impossible, but I'm doing it. And so there's this potential to be like, but look, Jesus said it and I'm doing it. Like that you become more certain. Like, I know it's impossible, but I'm doing it because Jesus said the word. And so here's what Jesus is getting at. Something shifted, Peter. Something shifted. What happened? Why did you doubt? What is it that made you go from certain, if you say the word I can do it, to, oh my goodness, I'm going to drown? What happened? And it's not just I was scared. That's part of the simplified description. But here's the thing. He wasn't afraid to ask. He had enough faith to say, can I walk on water with you? He wasn't afraid to step out of the boat. He had enough faith to do that. He wasn't afraid to take the first few steps. He had enough faith to do that. And so this is such a great question. And I don't know for sure, but my suspicion is Peter thought about this question for a long time. Like, what did happen? I was walking on water, doing it. And right in the middle, I doubted. What happened? Like, I believed, and then I didn't. I was certain, and then I was uncertain. I was fully trusting, and then I doubted. And here's what happened. Matthew tells us, when Peter saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified. So the wind and the waves didn't just start up. They were there, right? They were there all along. So this isn't a new development. In fact, we know from what we just read that the wind doesn't die down until Jesus gets into the boat with them. But for a few brief moments, Peter was not focused on the wind and the waves, or the darkness, or the long night. What changed? Peter's faith welled up in response to the presence of Jesus. And in response to the presence of Jesus, he asked the question to get out of the boat and walk on water. And so here's what changed. Instead of responding to the presence of Jesus, he responded to his circumstances. Anybody done that? Many of us could say, yeah, doing that right now. I mean, like, this is big. But here's what I want us to see, that it wasn't just a shift of feelings. We see faith sometimes as a feeling, like I'm feeling it and then I'm not feeling it so much. But what Jesus is pointing out is feelings didn't shift. Focus shifted. See the difference? And when your focus shifted, then your feelings followed. So it wasn't just a shift of feelings, it was a shift of focus. And when that shift took place, he began to listen to different voices that probably would have kept him in the boat in the first place. What was I thinking? I can't walk on water. I'm going to go down if I step out of this boat. These are the voices he's listening to when he starts looking around. when he shifts his focus. And this is something that happens to all of us, doesn't it? We get focused on our storm, our chaos. And let's just acknowledge that while it sounds great to say, just focus on Jesus, we all know in the real life storms, that is easier said than done. But what Jesus is telling Peter when he asks this question, what happened? Why'd you doubt? He's helping him see that if you had just kept your eyes on me, if you had kept me as the focus, you would have kept walking on water. So we read this in the very end. When they climbed back in the boat, the wind stopped. So that's kind of cool. Like you always heard the story of Jesus walking on water, but there's that other miracle. So for the disciples, they just did the feeding of the 5,000, got stuck in a storm, watched Jesus walk on water, watched Peter get out of the boat, walk on water, watched the storm cease the moment Jesus got in the boat. That's a lot of faith growth material right there. So remember I said that Jesus has a reason for saying get in the boat and insisting? Yeah, you're heading into a storm, but you're going to learn some things you were never going to see any other way. And all of this creates this new perspective on Jesus. The disciples worshiped him and said, you really are the Son of God. I mean, they watched him do all kinds of things. But this was like a pivotal moment. All of these things coming together. Watching Jesus appear in the middle of the storm. Watching Peter, in response to Jesus' word, walk on water. Watching the storm cease the moment Jesus got in the boat. All of this shifted something for them, and all of a sudden they're like, whoa. You really are the Son of God. I am sure Peter experienced something powerful in this whole experience. I would dare say the disciples too. They may not have been the ones that walk on water. Sometimes you hear the sermons like they're the slackers that stayed in the boat and the one guy with faith that got out. They're all real people. And I guarantee that the disciples who watched it never forgot, you know what? If Jesus says the word, we could walk on water. So let me do this as we wrap. Maybe you're in the middle of a storm right now. And whatever that is, whatever chaos is brewing around you, whatever struggle you find yourself in the middle of, what Jesus is addressing is the swing from faith to doubt. And it's a swing. It's not like we do it once. We keep doing it. Do you know what I'm talking about? I believe, I don't believe, I believe, I don't believe, I believe, I'm doubting, I believe, I'm doubting. And it's this fight. And what Jesus is reminding Peter is, so this is not a feeling. This is about a focus. So if you're in the middle of a storm, the question is a great one. What is it that's making you shift from, I believe God's got me, to, oh, I'm not so sure? That's the question Jesus is asking. What happened? What made you go from this to this? From certain to uncertain? Is it possible that you have shifted your focus from what God is capable of doing in your life to the overwhelming circumstances? And I don't want to minimize the circumstances. There are overwhelming circumstances. There are. And faith, let me just say this because I think we do a disservice sometimes in church when we talk about faith. Faith is not pretending your circumstances are not bad. What we sometimes try to do to put on the look of faith is you smile and say, oh, it's okay, God's got me. But inside you're like, my life is a wreck. Faith is not pretending it's something it's not. Faith is about where you put your focus. It's not even about being okay with your circumstances. You don't have to like the storm you're in and say, no, it's all good. God's got me here for a reason. But there's a faith piece that says, even in the middle of the storm, I believe God's got me. I want out of the storm. I still want to see the shore. But I do believe God's got me. And the key is your focus. Focusing on Him. Maybe this will help you, but one of the ways that we could describe it is when you think about focus but still being aware of the chaos, is it's like my eyes are on Jesus, but in my peripheral vision, I still am well aware of the storm. But see, what you see in your peripheral vision is not the focus. It's the stuff that you're still aware of. And the moment you shift, now that is your focus, and Jesus is in the peripheral vision. Does that make sense? This is what we're up against. So you don't have to pretend your storm's not there. You don't have to act like it's better than it is or different than it is or that you're perfectly fine in your storm because God's got you. What you have to do is continue to look to Jesus. And you'll still see those circumstances in your peripheral vision. You know how when you see something move and you want to react to it? That's there. But this is not about feeling. It's about focus. It's an amazing question Jesus asked. Why? Why did you doubt? What happened? What took you from faith to not faith? It's a question I hope you take with you. And whatever your circumstances are right now, whatever you find yourself in the middle of, to hear Jesus asking the question, and I hope, my prayer in this message is that in the same way that I believe this question echoed for Peter for years, I hope it echoes for us. That we become aware and start hearing the question not as a condemnation, but as a curiosity. I don't think Jesus was condemning Peter. I think he just wanted Peter to be curious, like, what just happened there? How did that shift? And so I want to invite you to, write the question down. Put it someplace where it's in front of you. When you find yourself in the middle of the situation, when you feel the shift, to be aware of it and to ask yourself, what happened? Where's my focus right now? And you may still have to continually put your focus back on Jesus, but that's what you're doing to align yourself by faith. To not let Jesus be in the peripheral vision and your storm be the main thing, but Jesus is the focus and the storm is still there in your peripheral vision. Lord, thank you for this amazing question that, I think we all are like, yeah, I relate to that one. That we know what it is to have faith, we do. And we know what it is to have that faith shaken in an instant, we do. We know what it is to swing almost immediately from I have faith to that just got broken. And so I pray that you would help us to hear this gracious question you asked Peter to assess. So what happened? How did you go from believing and walking on water to doubting and sinking? And I pray that we would be honest and aware and kind and generous to ourselves as you are to us, that we can acknowledge our doubts and shift our focus back to you, and then just learn to trust you more and more. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to play a song here that's just a close. You probably heard it.